The kitchen smelled like coffee and something I couldn't name at first. Something faintly wrong, the way a room smells when it's been rearranged without your permission. I stood in the doorway for a moment, still in my robe, and looked at the counter. My ceramic rooster, the one I'd had since Gerald and I bought it at a flea market in Asheville 30-some years ago, was gone. In its place sat a chrome paper towel holder I had never seen before. I told myself it was nothing. People move things. That's what I told myself. My name is Darcy, and I have lived in this house on Sycamore Lane in Raleigh, North Carolina, for 31 years. I raised 2 children in this house. I watched the oak tree in the backyard grow from a sapling I planted the summer my daughter was born into something tall enough to shade the entire patio. Gerald and I paid off the mortgage together in 2007. When he passed in 2018, the house became mine, completely, legally, paperwork and all mine. I know that because I went to the county recorder's office myself, 3 weeks after his funeral, just to hold the deed in my hands and remind myself that I still had something solid to stand on. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. My daughter's name is Alicia. She is 34 years old, and for most of her life I would have described her as steady, practical, not warm in the way some daughters are warm, but dependable. She called on Sundays. She came home for Christmas. She remembered my birthday without being prompted, which is more than I can say for a lot of people. She married her husband, Kevin, 6 years ago. I did not dislike Kevin when I met him. He was tall, good-looking in a bland sort of way, and he laughed too easily at his own jokes, which I've always found slightly suspicious in a person, but I didn't say that to anyone. I smiled at the rehearsal dinner, and I wore the dusty rose dress Alicia had picked out, and I meant every good wish I offered them. When they first asked to move in, 3 years ago, it was supposed to be temporary. Kevin's company had done a round of layoffs. Alicia was working, but her salary as a dental hygienist didn't cover their apartment rent in Durham, and their car payments and their student loans all at once. Could they stay with me for a few months? Just until Kevin found something? I had the room. I said yes. I want to be clear that I said yes with an open heart. I cleared out the guest room, the one with the window that looks over the backyard, and I bought a new mattress, and I even put a small lamp on the nightstand, so Alicia would have light to read by the way she always liked. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. I kept the cable package they preferred. I gave them a drawer in the refrigerator, and then eventually the whole bottom shelf. Kevin found a job 4 months later. A good one, project manager at a construction firm in Cary. The salary was decent. I know it was decent because Alicia told me it was, with a look on her face that was pure relief. They didn't mention moving out. I waited another month and brought it up gently over dinner. Alicia said they were still catching up on some debt. Kevin nodded in a way that suggested he preferred not to be part of this conversation. I said I understood, and I did, and another month passed, and then another, and then a year. I should tell you about the small things, because I think people always focus on the big moments and miss what actually changes a person. What actually changed me wasn't the moment things fell apart. It was the quiet accumulation of the months before. It was finding that my sewing chair had been moved from the sunroom to the garage because, as Alicia put it, they needed space for the Peloton they were apparently purchasing. It was Kevin watching television at a volume that vibrated the pictures on my hallway wall. And when I asked him to turn it down, he looked at Alicia instead of me, as if checking whether my requests required approval. It was Alicia refolding my pantry one Saturday without asking, throwing out canned goods she decided were too old, including a tin of smoked oysters I'd been saving since Gerald used to put them out on crackers at New Year's. It was the Sunday morning I came downstairs to find Kevin's friend Travis sitting at my kitchen table eating my cereal. Kevin introduced us. Travis waved. No one had asked me if Travis could be there. I stood in my kitchen in my robe, in my own house, and felt like the strange one. I started having my coffee in my bedroom. I told myself it was because I liked the quiet. It wasn't because of the quiet. My friend Barbara noticed before I said anything out loud. We've been friends since our kids were in elementary school together, and she has the particular talent of very perceptive women who've been paying attention to you for decades. She can tell something is wrong by the way you hold your coffee cup. We were sitting on my back porch one afternoon in October. a year and a half after Alicia and Kevin had moved in, and she put her cup down and looked at me directly. "You're not comfortable in your own house," she said. I started to say something about how it was an adjustment, living with other people again, and she shook her head. "Dorothy, you flinched when you heard Kevin's car in the driveway." I hadn't realized I'd done that. I sat with it for a moment. The oak tree was starting to turn. I'd planted that tree the summer Alicia was born. I'd watered it every dry week for the first 3 years of its life. "I don't know how this happened," I said. "You were too generous," Barbara said, not unkindly, "and they let you be." The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in February. I had made a decision, quietly, carefully, without drama, that I was going to convert the sunroom back into my sewing room. It was my house. It was my sunroom. The Peloton that had displaced my chair had been used approximately 6 times, and now held a collection of Kevin's workout clothes. I bought a new sewing cabinet on clearance at the craft store and arranged for it to be delivered Thursday. I mentioned this to Alicia on Tuesday evening while we were both in the kitchen. She frowned. "Where's Kevin going to put the Peloton?" "That's something you two can figure out," I said. "The garage is big enough." Alicia crossed her arms. I'd seen that gesture since she was 9 years old. "Mom, we're living here too. We should have some say in how the space is used." I kept my voice level. "This is my house, Alicia. I appreciate that we're all making it work, but the decisions about the space are mine." She looked at me then, in a way I still don't entirely know how to describe. Not quite contempt. Something colder than that. Something that had apparently been waiting for a while to come out. "You know," she said, "if you're going to be like this, if you're going to treat us like guests instead of family, then maybe this isn't working." I waited. "We've been here 2.5 years, she said. "We basically run this house. We buy groceries, we pay the utilities. You don't pay for anything except the mortgage, and honestly, you should be grateful we're here. Because without us, you'd be alone in this big house with nobody." She didn't yell. That was the thing. She said it with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact. I looked at my daughter. I thought about the 34 years I'd known her. I thought about the night she was born, and how I'd cried not from pain, but from something so large I didn't have a word for it. I thought about every school play, and every heartbreak, and every Sunday phone call, and I thought about how she was standing in the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 31 years telling me that I should be grateful. I said, "I understand." She seemed surprised I didn't argue. "Good," she said, and left the room. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed Gerald and I had shared, the bed I'd bought new sheets for when he got too sick to care about thread count anymore, the bed that is mine and has been mine since before Alicia could walk. And I was very still for a long time. I wasn't crying. That surprised me. I thought I would be. Instead, I felt something settle in me, like a gyroscope finding its center after being spun. I knew what I needed to do, and I knew that I was going to do it. The next morning, I called Linda Marsh, who is an attorney I've known for 20 years through my church. I told her the situation. She asked me a few careful questions. Then she said what I already knew, that the house was mine, that Alicia and Kevin had no tenancy agreement, that they had no legal standing to remain if I asked them to leave, and that if I wanted to formalize the process, she could help me draft a proper written notice. I said I'd like to do that. "Dorothy," Linda said, "are you sure? Because once you do this, things will change." "Things already changed," I told her. "I'm just catching up." The notice arrived to them by certified mail on a Friday morning. It was courteous and clear. It stated that as the sole owner of the property at this address, I was formally requesting that Alicia and Kevin vacate the premises within 60 days, by April 15th. It outlined that there was no existing lease, that no tenancy had been established, and that continued occupation would be considered unlawful after that date. Linda had written it, and she does not write things in ways that leave room for interpretation. I was in the backyard when Alicia came out to find me. She had the envelope in her hand. Her face was something I had to look at for a moment before I could read it. "You had us served," she said. "It's a notice," I said, "not a summons. Read the language." "Mom." Her voice cracked on that word in a way it hadn't the night she told me I should be grateful. "Mom, you can't be serious. I'm serious. We're your family. I looked at her steadily. Yes, I said. You are your family. I looked at her steadily. Yes, I said. You are. And I love you very much. That's not the question here. Then what is the question? The question, I said, is whose house this is. And we both know the answer to that. She stared at me for what felt like a long time. Kevin appeared at the back door with his coffee cup and took one look at the two of us and quietly went back inside. Alicia said, I can't believe you would do this. I know, I said, and I'm sorry that it came to this, but I am not sorry for what I'm asking. She went inside. I stayed in the backyard. The oak tree was bare in February, the way it gets. All bones and potential, no leaves yet. I'd stood under this tree when Gerald died. I'd stood under it when Alicia got her first acceptance letter from college. I'd watered it when it was no bigger than my arm. It would still be there in April, and so would I. The next 2 months were not easy. I want to be honest about that. Alicia went through several stages. There was anger, which I had expected. There were 2 weeks of silence that were somehow worse than the anger. There was an evening in March when she sat across from me at the kitchen table and cried in a way that reminded me she was still my daughter, and not just the person who had said those things in February. And I reached across and held her hand while she did. I didn't realize how much we'd overstepped, she said finally. I know, I said. Kevin kept saying it was fine, that you were lucky to have company. I let that sit there without commenting on it. I should have talked to you, she said. Really talked, not just assumed. Yes, I said. You should have. She looked up at me. Are you doing this to punish me? No, I said, and I meant it completely. I'm doing this because I need my house back. Because I need to feel like myself again. Because somewhere in the last 2.5 years I stopped being your mother and started being a background detail in your life. And I don't think that was good for either of us. She didn't say anything for a moment. I miss you, actually, I said. The version of you I talk to when we have real distance between us. That seemed to land differently than anything else I'd said. Kevin found them an apartment in Morrisville in mid-March, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a complex with a gym in the building. He seemed, if I'm being precise, somewhat relieved. I think he understood, better than Alicia did in that moment, that the notice was not an attack. It was a correction. They moved out on April 9th, 6 days ahead of the deadline. I helped carry a few boxes to the truck. Kevin shook my hand. That was a small surprise. He said, I'm sorry, Dorothy, for more than I said at the time. I believed him. People can surprise you. Alicia and I stood in the driveway for a moment after Kevin got in the truck. Can I call you? She said. I will be very upset if you don't, I said. She hugged me then, longer than she had in years. And I held on, because she is my daughter. And because love and boundaries are not opposites. Even though it took me 72 years and a certified letter to understand that, clearly enough to act on it. The first morning I woke up alone in my house, I lay in bed and listened. The refrigerator hum. A bird outside the window. The particular creak the second stair makes when the house settles in the early morning. Sounds I knew the way you know. A song you've heard your whole life. I got up and I went downstairs and I made a pot of coffee and I stood in my kitchen with my ceramic rooster. I'd found it in a box in the garage where Kevin had apparently moved it to make room for a blender, and I set it back in its spot on the counter. Then I stood there in the early morning light and I drank my coffee in the kitchen of my house, in my robe, at my counter, looking out my window at my oak tree, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself. Alicia calls on Sundays again. We talk for an hour, sometimes more. Last week, she told me about a new restaurant she and Kevin tried in downtown Raleigh and asked if I wanted to come with them next time, and I said yes. Kevin has apparently taken a project management certification course online, and she said it with pride, the way she used to talk about him before everything got so tangled. She came over for dinner last month, just her, while Kevin had a work thing. We sat at the kitchen table with pasta and good bread and a bottle of the Riesling we both like, and we talked the way we hadn't talked in years, about Gerald, about her childhood, about a trip I'm thinking about taking to see my college roommate in Savannah, You seem different, she said. I'm the same, I said. I'm just home. She looked around the kitchen for a moment, at the rooster on the counter, at the old cross stitch I'd done in 1994, hanging by the window, at the chipped tile above the stove that Gerald always said he'd fix and never did, and that I have kept exactly as it is because some imperfections are actually just history. I'm sorry I let it get to that point, she said quietly. Me too, I said. Me too. We split the last of the Riesling and I walked her to her car and waved from the driveway in the cold night air, and when she drove away I stood there for a minute before going inside. The neighborhood was quiet. The oak tree made a sound in the small wind. I went in and locked the door, my door, and turned off the kitchen light, and I went upstairs to my room, and I slept better than I had in 2.5 years. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone going through what I went through. Not the legal part. Linda handled that cleanly, and the paperwork was the easy portion, if I'm honest. What I tell someone is about the much quieter thing that happened before any of it. The thing that's harder to name. I let myself disappear slowly, and I called it love while I was doing it. That's the part that took me the longest to see clearly. When I moved my sewing chair so Kevin could put a Peloton in my sunroom, I told myself I was being flexible. When I started drinking my morning coffee upstairs in my bedroom instead of in my own kitchen, I told myself I liked the quiet. Every small retreat had a reasonable explanation, and I believed every one of them, and none of them were true. The truth was that I had decided, somewhere along the way, that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping my dignity. It is not. Those are entirely different things. What Alicia said to me that February evening, that I should be grateful, was cruel in the way that only partially true things can be cruel. I was alone. The house was big. Having people around did fill something. But gratitude for being tolerated in your own home is not really gratitude. It's surrender with a polite name on it. What I understand now is that the moment I stopped setting any limits was the moment I stopped teaching Alicia anything useful. Not intentionally. I never sat down and thought, I will show my daughter that her comfort matters more than mine. But that is exactly what I showed her over and over for 2.5 years. We teach people how to treat us not with lectures, but with what we accept. I accepted too much, and in doing so I made it easier for her to stop seeing me. That is not a judgment of Alicia. She is my daughter, and I know her heart. But kindness that never holds a line is not really kindness. It is avoidance, dressed up to look generous. The most honest thing I ever did for my relationship with her was to say clearly and in writing, "This is mine and I need it back." It hurt both of us. It was still the right thing. There is a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't make speeches. It just gets very still and very clear and picks up the phone to call an attorney on a Wednesday morning. I didn't feel brave when I did it. I felt tired and sad and more certain than I'd felt about anything in years. Maybe that is what real resolve actually feels like. Not fire, just clarity. What I know now, at 72, living alone in my house on Sycamore Lane with my ceramic rooster back on the counter where it belongs, is this. The life you want does not come to you because you waited patiently enough. It comes because you decided it was worth asking for. And sometimes asking looks like a 60-day notice delivered by certified mail. That oak tree in my backyard is still there. I planted it myself. I watered it for years before it needed me. It has outlasted a lot of things. So have I.